Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Toro y Moi called Outer Peace. You know, I remember the last time I talked about Chillwave, way back in 2015 when I reviewed Neon Indian. And that is saying something because I'm getting the impression that that whole genre designation of Chillwave, that's something music critics nowadays kind of want to forget ever happened. See, there's a phenomenon, especially among some music critics and writers, to apply some genre branding sounds for quick categorization, or just make one up, especially if it seems like it's a trend that's on the rise. Now, this seemed to hit its peak in the blog and pitchfork-dominated era of the late 2000s and very early 2010s, mostly to the indifference or outright distaste of the artist or indeed anyone outside of music writers. And looking back on that now, it's hard to ignore how manufactured it felt. Not an organic label created by the artist who had approached the gauzy blend of shoegaze, lo-fi synth-pop, ambient, and psychedelia with a variety of different tones and styles, but more of a branding that soon led to a saturated market and a broad misunderstanding of how anyone was to approach it. And I want to use Toro y Moi, stage name for Chaz Bear, as an example against this easy sort of classification. Most because while his initial tones might have started off in that loose subgenre, he didn't really stay there. A few albums in, he was expanding more into house music. By 2015, he was pulling on that jangling 80s indie rock sound, and he had always had a taste for funk, choppy hip-hop-esque samples, and a crooning that owed a considerable debt to indie R&B. So yeah, Toro y Moi was really kind of tough to categorize, and man, I wish I liked him more. Again, like most genre-hopping bands with this sort of pedigree, there were a number of things that just didn't really work for me, and ironically, they start with the opposite problem that I had with Neon Indian, and that I kind of really liked the gummy, lo-fi, chillwave touches in the production that felt more like accent texture than just drowning out the mix. But the further that Chaz Bear has stepped away from it, the less interesting a lot of the music has become. Part of this was increasingly easy parallels to better acts, but with Toro y Moi's voice moving more to the forefront, the undercooked writing and the odd feeling of petulance in the writing really started to grate on my nerves and patience, especially as the albums got longer with less momentum behind them. Now granted, when I heard this album was going even more synthetic and taking more steps towards funk, I was intrigued, especially with a pretty short runtime, but I've had mixed luck with this brand of funk in the past, and I wasn't sure that the trappings of Chillwave were what I needed to make it work for me. But alright, what the hell. How is Outer Peace? Well, I don't know. I've been sitting with this album since it leaked, trying to find an inroad to discuss my feelings on it. And it's kind of funny. While I can describe how much this album feels like just another odd turn for Toro y Moi, sliding towards the bouncier, defined dance grooves of Anything in Return, amidst some of his cleanest and, dare I say, most contemporary and accessible production to date, the odd thing is that I wouldn't really say this album moved the needle much for me when it comes to this act. It's certainly not the worst project they put out to date. There's enough thematic coherence and groove to keep this in quality territory, but at the same time, it slides Toro y Moi towards a more anonymous sound that isn't quite resonating for me, especially in comparison to the first 2 or 3 albums that felt more textured. So yeah, it's decent, it's even good, but I definitely would not call this great. And you know what, in fact, let's start off with some of that production texture, because more than ever, this album seems to have polished away the layers of damp reverb and organic fuzz that gave Toro y Moi so much flavor early on, instead tilting towards a more brittle set of beats, chilly synthesizers, and increasingly clipped auto-tune wrapping around Chaz Bear's vocals. You could make the argument that this isn't even really in Chillwave anymore. Even the guitar and the bass frolic feels ever so slightly oily against the blockier percussion, and a mix that might have some really well-defined space, but doesn't really bring up the same type of cushion or density. And I'll say that when it at least comes with Chaz Bear's delivery, that might have been a misstep, because he already doesn't have an incredibly distinctive vocal timbre, and it's not like the auto-tune or other warping contortions trying to complement his low-key funk, they really add to his personality all that much. And you know what, while there are songs like Who Am I that might imply he's kind of aware of that for him, it's not exactly a redeeming factor either. And sure, the vocals have rarely ever been the most important thing about any Toro y Moi projects, but when you have that warped falsetto playing off the blubbery house groove a fading, or really whenever the falsetto shows up at all, or all the warped, crackling gargles across Freelance, it's hard to avoid the feeling that some of these vocals might be getting more emphasis in the mix than they really should, and that's not a good thing. And look, I will freely admit that that can kind of be exasperating for me to point out when there are songs that can pick up a much more textured and interesting groove, and that'll probably deserve the most attention. Even though I don't really like the synth on the hook, the hand percussion playing off the funk and the piano is really solid and ordinary pleasure, and the watery strumming on Baby Drive It Down against the blockier beat might just be the best song here. I really dug the groove. Hell, even if they do feel a little bit cleaner than I'd personally prefer, the stuttered patter of the drums against the rubbery house synth line on Laws of the Universe, it's got some real groove behind it, and the dense percussion line against the spacey fragments on Who Am I, it connects pretty well too. It's got a good house vibe to that song. But then we have cuts like Miss Me with some of the sensual vocals from Abra that fills out the background with the minimalist keys and the bird song, or the layered vocal fragments surrounding a lot of Monte Carlo, or the warping pianos and even thicker autotune and beat on 50/50. But you know what? With the borderline trap percussion on all these songs, you could give the instrumental to Bryson Tiller or Daniel Caesar, and most people would not be able to tell the difference. And that's not something I would have ever said about Toro y Moi before, and again, not exactly a good step. And that skirts around how much songs like New House and Monte Carlo owe a pretty obvious debt to Blonde era Frank Ocean in their approach and tone, if not exact timbre. And for an artist who has been praised so fervently for blending and elevating a lot of his influences, to see him not deliver in this category or even fall beneath some of his influences, that can be frustrating. But that's not even mentioning the most prominent influence, especially in the content. And let's get to that blatant shout-out moment that most indie rock fans will recognize instantly. The final verse of Laws of the Universe that is an explicit response to the critically beloved debut single Losing My Edge by LCD Soundsystem. And this moment really is the key to explaining the entire theme of this album, because it showcases the impermanence of those parties and how age and time will make it all just slip away, which, yes, even for the muted haze of Toro y Moi, is a thought that lingers and has presence. All across the album, the most pronounced motifs are fading pleasure, getting older, and an increasingly desperate desire to have something somewhat permanent out of all of it, find some level of outer peace. And while James Murphy began his career trying to write himself into music history, there is a little bit more pathos when it comes to someone like Chaz Bear, who has been active and busy a lot longer. Although, let's get real, he's only been about a decade, and while he's churned out a lot of work, it can feel a little bit thinner when you remember he is only in his early 30s. It's a bit early for a midlife crisis here, but so many millennials want to be older and wiser than we really are. So in a sense, I do get why he kind of wants those old symbols of success and permanence and the house and the car, even as he realizes their own worth to him can feel lessened if he's always on the road and he can't really appreciate them. And I like how he highlights that lack of permanence has led for many to a real crisis of identity, all the more accentuated by life on the road and social media. And I really appreciate the framing of this scene, very aware of the potential emptiness of building an identity online, but it's not like what he's using is any less ephemeral, so who is he to judge? And it also becomes very clear he's seeking some of this out in the face of not having more of a relationship connection, and I think if this album is going to stumble away from a strong conclusion, it's going to be here. Yeah, those relationships can be just as fleeting, and he knows it, but that same weird feeling of petulance in the writing prevents any of that outer peace he seeks from really materializing to drive this home. And it makes some of his stabs in that direction feel really inconclusive at best and kind of lightly toxic at worst. Really did not like how this album ended. But as a whole, look, if you're looking for a new Toro y Moi project that might be the most accessible they put out to date, this is easy to recommend. But at this point, Chaz Bear has taken the project enough steps away from the original sound that I can see some fans really turning on this just in terms of production technique alone, which is kind of a shame, because I think there's some good ideas and thematic consistency here that I at least appreciate. Granted, it's not a project that I find exceptional or really groundbreaking. In fact, I'd probably make the argument it's Toro y Moi's safest album to date, but again, fine enough. I'm thinking a solid 6 out of 10. Recommended for the fans or the curious, but otherwise you can probably move past it. Hell, most of the time, you might even think he's expecting you to move on past, so hey, take of that what you will. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. A little bit weird with this album. I kind of really wanted to like it more, but it happens. You want to actually buy or stream it, links down there below, and I got the poll out there for all the Toro y Moi fans to tell me how wrong I am. Haven't really seen people asking for this though, so I don't know how many of you there are. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to help support this channel, the link down to my Patreon is right over there. I'm still in the process of revamping things, but hey, if you guys want to support, I'm not going to say no. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.